Lampyro here. I thought I'd do a video, a tier list video, on all the different weapons in Pyro's arsenal. There are many different weapons that he has, and each one suits a different role on what it can do to give him advantages or disadvantages in the battlefield. And I thought I'd just give my opinions or 2 cents on what I think of each weapon. Now, I'm not going to lie, I haven't used some of these as much as others. Maybe, you know, I've used it once and completely hated it. But you're going to get those types of opinions in this video. So let's start with all the primary weapons. So Pyro has a few primary weapons. He has 5 right now. Let's go over each one. So the back burner. I think the back burner is great, but I think it is very situational. So I'm going to be putting the back burner in B tier because in order to get really good use out of the back burner, you have to be behind somebody. And unless you can get behind enemy lines, no matter which side you're on, it's not really going to serve you a lot of good, especially with no random critical hits. You're missing out on random crits, which can sometimes be a game changer. And you're also dealing with decreased amount of use for air blast, um, which is very punishing for the pyro, considering one of his most important jobs is air blasting away demo and soldier and even sometimes engineer sentry turret rockets. That's a very important role for pyro. So I believe it belongs in B tier. Next, we'll be going over the degreaser. The degreaser, I think it's a pretty good weapon. I'm going to be putting it in A tier. It is a great weapon, especially if you pair it with a really powerful secondary or even a third weapon. Uh, it's really powerful for degreaser extinguisher combo. Even though the extinguisher only does mini crits now, it's still a pretty powerful combo. Um, you do get that disadvantage with air blast, but it's not as punishing as with the back burner. And you do lose out on some afterburn damage, but that can easily be undone with a very powerful secondary, like a flare gun or something, of course. Or you could also pair it with the gas passer, and you could essentially make up for that lost afterburn damage, even on other pyros. The Dragon's Fury. This I used this weapon for a little bit when it first came out in Jungle Inferno. I thought it was a pretty good weapon, but it just feels like it's missing something. You really have to get it going before it's actually a good weapon. You have to get a couple hits and a couple kills before it really starts ramping up, and then before you know it, you're out of ammo. It actually burns through ammo quite quickly. So I'm gonna be putting it. Okay. It's a tie between A and B. I'm gonna go ahead and put it in the B tier. Well, it's a strong weapon. It really burns through ammo quickly, in my opinion, and the need for you to start doing damage and start getting kills in order for it to reach its really max potential, kind of puts the weapon down. Really, it's just it could be better in many ways. That's not to say that it's already a pretty good weapon, but I think it belongs in the same category with the back burner because it's very situational. It's very situational in a way that you need to you need to do damage to the enemy in order for it to be a really effective weapon. Next, stock. Yeah, we're putting stock in S tier. Not all of the Pyro stock weapons will be in S tier, but I believe this one belongs in S tier. Stock flamethrower, of course, has no real downsides. There are a few upsides it could be missing, like the backburners crits behind enemies, or the ramping up damage with the Dragon's Fury or the faster swapping speed. But honestly, the flamethrower doesn't really need that because its air blast is really its most essential tool. Um, The air blast is a really important mechanic in the game, especially for the pyro, in making sure that you can protect yourself and your teammates from incoming rockets and grenades. It's really kind of an invaluable thing to have. And, most of these weapons have disadvantages or, just outright don't have, I'm looking at you, Phlogistinator, outright don't have air blast, which is pretty detrimental. So I believe it belongs in S tier. I honestly think it's the best pyro primary currently. And yeah, that's my opinion on the flamethrower. Next is the Phlogistinator. And um, this thing can be really fun sometimes, but you will get a lot of shit for using it. Because, of course, you're essentially building up to get free crits. And you can especially be cheap with this if you use a secondary weapon like the flare gun or something. You just sit back in the map and shoot a flare gun and build up your crits with the Phlogistinator. You will be looked very much down upon for doing that with this weapon. So I'm gonna put this weapon in the C tier because it does not have air blast. That is like its biggest downfall of all time. If it had some sort of air blast without needing to have to be combined with the man melter, and by the way, the man melter only extinguishes teammates. You can't reflect rockets with the combo, so you're still pretty much useless against oncoming rocket and grenade fire. Um, if it had a combo with another weapon in order to negate that, it would probably move up a tier or two, maybe even to A tier. But I think it belongs in C tier. I think it's kind of one of the worst primaries. That's not to say it's really powerful. You can have a lot of fun with this weapon, and you can get some really, really hilarious streaks with this weapon. But it fundamentally it's just missing that air blast, and that is a huge, huge thing that you need to have. All right, so let's move on to secondaries. We'll start with the detonator. The detonator is a really great weapon for pyro for one fact only besides the flare gun, and that's for flare gun jumping. Before the thermal thrusters, the detonator was really the only way you could get up high with the pyro by doing a detonation jump or a flare gun jump. It was a very important tool for doing that sort of thing for pyro, for verticality movement. So I believe it belongs in the A tier. It's still very good for verticality movement, and it may not get you as much distance as the thermal thruster, but it is still very good, especially for getting to a few spots on a few maps. And you can still do damage to other players, which is one thing the thermal thruster can't give you. And I might as well just go ahead and switch over to thermal thruster. I'm putting thermal thruster in B tier. Thermal thruster gets B tier because while it outdoes the detonator in terms of movement, you are a sitting duck with your flamethrower and your melee. Uh, Pyro has a lot of good secondary weapons at his disposal, and you are absolutely missing out on that by using the thermal thruster. Um, if it weren't for the fact that it's really good at getting you places, or for um, doing a quick flank at the enemy, jumping in with a thermal thruster, doing some damage to the flamethrower, and then jumping out. If it wasn't for that fact, the thermal thruster would actually belong in C tier because you're losing out on potential damage that you could be doing with a secondary weapon. Next, we'll do the flare gun. The flare gun is a really good weapon. In my opinion, it's not the best secondary weapon for Pyro. I'm actually going to give it A tier. It sits alongside the detonator, even though you can't do a self blast jump like you can with the detonator. It's still a pretty all around reliable weapon, and it's used by very many pyros, and it's just a good weapon. Next, we'll be doing the gas passer. The gas passer, once again, I used it for a little bit when Jungle Inferno came out. I just recently started using it again. And honestly, in I believe it belongs in C tier. Now, let me explain why. Um, the gas passer really is kind of a situational weapon. You need to have a big group of enemies to toss it on, but it is good for area denial. But the biggest thing dragging this weapon down is the charge time for it. It takes too long to get a charge for the gas passer. By the time you have a charge with the gas passer, a sniper could probably have two Giratis ready. And, this thing is certainly more powerful than the Girati because it lingers in the air. Um, but it's not really a great secondary weapon for the Pyro. I believe it needs a buff of some sort. I don't know what it is. It just needs a buff. And it actually used to be quite the powerhouse for MVM, for what I understand, but they nerfed it. Um, if they undid that nerf for MVM, I would bring this weapon up to a B tier just for being useful in MVM. Um, and actually, the Phlogistonator is quite useful for MVM too, but only really for tanks and for last wave. Um, but if it was more useful for MVM, I would move it up a tier. But as it stands, the Gas Passer, it's just not really a great secondary weapon. Next, we're moving on to the Man Melter. This is my first D tier weapon. So I have quite a few problems with the Man Melter. My main problems with the Man Melter are just pretty much everything about the weapon, honestly. It's not really a great weapon to use. You could do a lot more things with other flare guns than you could with the Man Melter. It is pretty useful when you combo it with the Phlogistonator, but only for putting out teammates when you get those crits for putting out the teammates. But when you get those crits, it does a flat 110, so you can't even one-shot a scout. That's embarrassing. That is downright embarrassing for this weapon. It's not really worth it. It's not really worth using in any sort of way. Once again, I think this weapon, out of the most on this list, needs a buff of some sort. It doesn't need a crazy buff like the Phlogistonator. It doesn't need a crazy buff, but it needs something to make it stand out other than pressing and holding right click to put out your teammates, which is making up for a disadvantage of the Phlogistonator. It needs its own thing. Next is the panic attack. This is a personal favorite weapon of mine. Now, most of the time when you're a pyro, you're mainly going to be having your primary out, your flamethrower. But there are going to be times where you're going to need to pull out your secondary and maybe finish off an enemy. I'm putting the panic attack in S tier. I honestly believe it's one of the best secondaries for pyro. There's only one other secondary I consider alongside this weapon to be worthy of S tier, and that would actually be the Scorch Shot. We all know why the Scorch Shot is up here. It has the most advantages out of any flare gun in this list. It just does everything right. It does the burning. It does exploding on drop. It does pretty much everything you want a flare gun to do, and it has a sick ass taunt kill. It's probably the sickest ass taunt kill I've ever seen for the pyro. But going back to the panic attack is a great weapon for just switching to and finishing off an enemy that you've already lit on fire and you need to kill. The shotgun, of course, can do that for you, but I feel like the panic attack is a better weapon for the choice because the panic attack functions as the more you shoot it, the inaccurate it gets. But if you only pull it out when you need it after you use your primary, you're basically getting free damage. You're getting a free damage and accuracy buff than you would have had with the shotgun. So the shotgun is actually going to go in A tier. It's a great secondary, and it's stock, but it's not better than the panic attack, in my opinion. It's not better than the panic attack or the scorch shot. The scorch shot and the panic attack are better than the shotgun. Finally, we have the reserve shooter. Oh boy, this one received one of the biggest nerfs ever, and of course it deserved it because it was such an overpowered combo. All you have to do is press M2, Q, and you basically win. You basically win. So I'm going to put this in C tier. While it was once a great weapon, and it still is kind of viable, it's honestly outclassed by a few other secondaries up here in A and S tier. And actually outclassed even by the thermal thruster, in my opinion. It's just not a great weapon to use for the pyro anymore. That's not saying you can't use it, but I think honestly you're better off using any one of these other secondaries on the list. Okay, we finally made it to the melee weapon category. Let's start with the extinguisher. This weapon, like the reserve shooter, used to be a powerhouse. It used to do crits on inflamed targets, and it was a very, very powerful weapon. But now there are somewhat better choices, but honestly, not really. You have a few other weapons that can meet some niche categories, like the home wrecker. You can get rid of sappers, or the neon annihilator can also get rid of sappers. That's actually a pretty useful thing to have, but if you kill the spy, you're not going to have to deal with sappers. So it's a very situational thing. You have to get to your building before your engineer does. Um, and then the power jack also gives you like a speed boost. And we're not going to talk about this one. But basically, the extinguisher, I think it falls in A tier. It's still a good melee weapon to use, but it is not the best melee weapon to use. Not in my opinion. There is one other that's pretty good, in my opinion, to use. The back scratcher. I'm going to put this in C tier. While it does benefit you for knowing the locations of health packs on maps and more damage, getting decreased health pickup from medics and dispensers is really a really bad sort of thing to have. Now, it is good for building Ubers, I think, but honestly, it's just a really bad thing to have um, if you're playing casually. Which, of course, is what I'm really making this list for, is for the casual players of TF2. Um, if you're casual, and even if you're new to the game, you might not know all the locations of the health packs. And in that case, this weapon would not really benefit you at all. So I'd recommend staying away from this weapon. It's not really useful, and its upsides, including the increased damage, like in my opinion, you're never really going to get to use melee weapons with pyro unless you're using the extinguisher. You're never really going to get like melee kills with pyro. It's a rare thing because you're already in close proximity with the flamethrower or the shotgun. You're probably going to use one of those before you use a melee weapon. So, in my opinion, it belongs in C tier. The fire axe. The fire axe is bad. It's probably the worst stock weapon. Uh, It's probably one of the worst stock weapons. It doesn't do a lot of damage and doesn't have really any upside that benefits it from the other melee weapons that Pyro has. I don't believe it deserves a spot in any of these other tiers because it just doesn't really do a lot for you. And, melee weapons for the Pyro are kind of about gimmicks. It's kind of about gimmicks for the Pyro to benefit engineers and stuff like that. The Home Wrecker. I'm going to place this in B tier along with the Neon Annihilator. I believe they both belong in B tier because of the one perk that they have for removing sappers. That's a pretty useful perk to have. But besides that, they're not really useful in terms of damage dealing weapons. The Home Wrecker has 25% less damage against players, which is pretty detrimental Um, for if you need to use it, you're just going to be down 25% damage from the get go. And then the Annihilator is very situational because your target needs to essentially be in water in order for you to get crits. And not a lot of maps have water. So you're not going to be using this weapon that much unless you're like a pyro shark or something like that. You know, it's very situational. But they deserve B tier for being able to get rid of sappers, which can be useful for helping out engineers. Uh, the hot hand, or as I like to call it, Big Slappy. Big Slappy is not a really useful weapon, in my opinion. It was funny. It was funny to use, and it's about as fun to use as the Holy Mackerel for Scout. But that's about all you get from this weapon. It's pretty mediocre. So I'm actually going to say it belongs in the D tier. I used it maybe a few times during Jungle Inferno, but I switched off it immediately for something else. It's just not a really useful weapon for the Pyro. The Power Jack. Now, yes, it is kind of a weak melee weapon to use, but it is one of the best for comboing. It gives you a speed boost, which is really, really, really useful for the Pyro because he's sort of a slow class. While the Power Jack might not be useful in terms of dealing damage as a melee weapon, once again, I've expressed that you're mostly going to be using your primaries and secondaries. So the only time you're really going to be pulling out your melee weapon is when you have nothing else and you're out of ammo or you need to get away. And the Power Jack is the perfect weapon to help you get away. There will be a few times where you do actually get kills with this weapon, but ultimately you're going to be using it for that speed boost, and it's going to be worth it pretty much in every single way. It does mark you kind of for death, just like the Gloves of Running Urgently does for heavy. But honestly, it's a negatable downside. All you have to do is switch off it, and you're back to normal pretty much. The Sharpened Volcano Fragment, D tier. I actually believe that the Sharpened Volcano Fragment is worse than the stock Fire Axe for Pyro. Because come on, I mean seriously, it it does what a flamethrower already does for you. It's useless. It's practically it's a joke. It's a joke weapon almost. I do kind of wish they would come back to this weapon and they would honestly just change it up in some sort of way and blow everyone away on what kind of new weapon it could be. But for the longest time and for the time being, it remains a joke to all other pyros. And you're just better off missing this weapon. Uh, the third degree. This is the final weapon on the tier list. And I'm going to place it in the C tier. It is pretty much a direct upgrade from stock. I don't know really what else to say for the weapon. It is pretty much a direct upgrade from stock. You can hit medics from their healing partners. That is a straight upgrade. There's almost no downside to using this weapon. And in my opinion, it looks cooler than the stock Fire Axe. So guys, that's been the tier list for pyro weapons. I hope you enjoyed the video. I got this idea for the video. Basically, I saw Banny put out a video of his tier list for TF2 weapons, and I thought I would just do the same thing, but for pyro, since I main pyro. So I hope you guys enjoyed this video. I'm just going to be doing this as like a one-time thing. I don't plan on really doing tier lists in the future unless they majorly change up a lot of these weapons for the pyro, mainly the ones in C and D tier. These weapons need to at least be looked at or they need to be changed, in my opinion. But all the weapons from B tier and up, I think they're fine as they are. So thanks for watching, and I hope you have a good one.